The rejection letter arrived on cream-colored stationery so thick and expensive it felt like velvet between my fingers. Montclair Country Club's gold-embossed letterhead caught the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Buckhead penthouse, and for a moment, I almost laughed at the irony. They had used paper that probably cost more per sheet than some people earned in an hour to tell me I wasn't good enough for their little sanctuary of white privilege. Thank you for your interest in membership at Montclair Country Club. The letter began in the kind of formal language that rich people used when they wanted to sound important. After careful consideration by our membership committee, we regret to inform you that your application has not been approved at this time. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. No explanation. No specific reasons. Just a polite legal way of saying what they really meant. We don't want people like you in our club. Victoria Sterling sat in the leather armchair that had been her father's favorite, the one positioned perfectly to catch the sunrise over Atlanta's skyline every morning. She had inherited more than just his furniture when he died 5 years ago. She had inherited his steel spine, his brilliant mind for business, and his absolute refusal to let anyone make him feel inferior because of the color of his skin. At 42, Victoria possessed the kind of quiet elegance that made people stop and stare without quite knowing why. She wore her success like fine jewelry, visible to those who knew what to look for, but never ostentatious or desperate for attention. Her natural hair was styled in a sleek bob that framed her face perfectly, and this morning she wore a cream-colored silk blouse and tailored black slacks that whispered of expensive taste and understated wealth. But as she held the rejection letter from Montclair Country Club, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The hot, familiar sting of being judged and found wanting by people who had never worked a day in their privileged lives. The application process had taken 6 months. 6 months of background checks, financial statements, letters of recommendation, and committee meetings where she had been scrutinized like a specimen under a microscope. She had provided documentation of her net worth, a figure that would have made most of the existing members dizzy with envy. She had submitted references from governors, senators, Fortune 500 CEOs, and university presidents. She had even agreed to the humiliating interview process, where a panel of blue-blooded Atlantans had asked her probing questions about her business, her family background, and her intentions regarding membership. Through it all, Victoria had maintained her composure, answering their questions with the grace and intelligence that had made her one of the most successful venture capitalists in the Southeast. She had smiled politely when they asked about her background, in ways that were clearly code for wanting to know exactly how a black woman had accumulated enough wealth to afford their $30,000 initiation fee and $5,000 annual dues. She had been patient when they questioned whether she would fit in with their existing membership, whether she understood their traditions and values. She had nodded graciously when they suggested that perhaps she might be more comfortable at one of Atlanta's other private clubs, the ones that catered to diverse membership. Victoria had endured it all because Montclair Country Club represented something important to her: acceptance into the highest levels of Atlanta society. The club's membership roster read like a who's who of old money families, political power brokers, and business leaders who had shaped the city for generations. Being accepted would have meant that Victoria Sterling, the granddaughter of a sharecropper, the daughter of a man who had built a construction empire from nothing, had finally, officially arrived. But they had rejected her anyway. Victoria set the letter on the antique mahogany table beside her chair and picked up her phone. The contact list was extensive. Powerful people across multiple industries who owed their success, at least in part, to her investment decisions and strategic guidance. She scrolled through the names, looking for the one person who could give her the information she needed. "Marcus Reed," she said aloud, finding his number and pressing call. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of old Atlanta money. "Victoria Sterling, as I live and breathe. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "Marcus, I need information about Montclair Country Club. Specifically, their financial situation." There was a pause, and Victoria could practically hear Marcus's mental calculator working. Marcus Reed was a trust fund baby who had graduated from leveraging his family connections into a career as a corporate acquisition specialist. He made his living knowing which companies were struggling, which ones were ripe for takeover, and which ones could be saved with the right injection of capital and expertise. That's an interesting question, Victoria. May I ask why? They rejected my membership application. Marcus's sharp intake of breath told her everything she needed to know about how shocking that news was to someone who understood her true financial position. They what? That's impossible. Do you know what your net worth documentation showed? I have a pretty good idea, yes. Then they're either completely insane or... Marcus trailed off, clearly realizing that he was about to say something that might offend her. Or what, Marcus? Or they're operating on principles that have nothing to do with money or qualifications. His voice was carefully neutral, but Victoria caught the implication, which would make them not only bigoted but also financially stupid. So they are in financial trouble. Victoria, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but Montclair is in serious difficulties. Their membership has been declining for 5 years, their facilities need major renovations, and they're carrying debt that would make your hair curl. They've been looking for a buyer or a major investor for months. Victoria felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. How much trouble, Marcus? The kind of trouble that ends with bankruptcy if they don't find salvation in the next 60 days. And what would salvation look like, hypothetically speaking? Someone with deep pockets and a desire to preserve the club's traditions. Marcus paused again. Victoria, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that I might be interested in preserving traditions, Marcus. Just not the ones they expect. After she hung up, Victoria sat in her father's chair and stared out at the Atlanta skyline. Somewhere out there, in their perfectly manicured corner of Buckhead, the members of Montclair Country Club were going about their days secure in the knowledge that they had successfully protected their sanctuary from undesirable elements. They had no idea that their rejection of Victoria Sterling would prove to be the most expensive mistake in their club's 100-year history. Victoria had been born into money, but she had been raised with the understanding that wealth was meaningless without the wisdom to use it effectively. Her father, Jonathan Sterling, had built his construction empire by being smarter, more ruthless, and more strategic than his competitors. He had taught his only daughter that success wasn't just about accumulating assets, it was about understanding power and knowing how to wield it with surgical precision. "Baby girl," he used to tell her during their Sunday morning walks through their estate in College Park, "rich white folks will always think they're better than us, no matter how much money we have. But money is power, and power is something they understand. The trick is making them realize you have more of both than they do." Jonathan Sterling had died before seeing his daughter become one of the youngest partners in the history of Meridian Capital, the boutique investment firm that managed portfolios for some of the wealthiest families in America. He hadn't lived to see her leave Meridian to start her own venture capital company, Sterling Enterprises, which had grown into one of the most successful minority-owned firms in the country. But he had taught her everything she needed to know about turning other people's mistakes into opportunities. Victoria spent the next 3 days conducting her own investigation into Montclair Country Club's finances. What she discovered was even worse than Marcus had indicated. The club wasn't just in trouble, it was hemorrhaging money at a rate that would have impressed a gambling addict. Their membership had declined from 800 families to fewer than 400 over the past decade, as younger generations showed less interest in the stuffy traditions and astronomical costs of country club life. The ones who remained were mostly older members on fixed incomes who had been lobbying for reduced fees and amenities cuts. Meanwhile, the club's facilities were falling apart. The golf course needed complete renovation, the main clubhouse required a new roof and updated electrical systems, and the tennis courts were developing cracks that made them dangerous to use. Conservative estimates put the necessary improvements at $15 million. Money the club simply didn't have. But the most interesting discovery was the club's ownership structure. Montclair Country Club was technically owned by a private corporation, Montclair Holdings, which had been established in 1923 by the club's founding families. Over the decades, shares in the holding company had been passed down through inheritance, sold to new members, and traded in private transactions that had created a complex web of ownership. The current largest shareholder was Harrison Whitmore III, whose grandfather had been one of the club's founders. Harrison owned 37% of the company and served as chairman of the board of directors. He was also, Victoria learned through some discreet inquiries, the man who had personally led the committee meeting where her membership application had been rejected. Harrison Whitmore III was old Atlanta aristocracy, the kind of man who measured his worth in bloodlines and social connections rather than actual accomplishments. His family's money came from cotton and railroad investments made a century ago, managed by trustees and investment firms that had kept the Whitmore fortune intact through careful stewardship and risk-averse strategies. But Harrison himself had never worked a day in his life, unless you counted serving on various non-profit boards and country club committees as employment. He was 68 years old, soft around the middle from decades of expensive lunches, and carried himself with the unconscious arrogance of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Victoria had met him briefly during her application process, a handshake and 30 seconds of small talk at a charity gala they had both attended. She remembered thinking that he looked like the kind of man who still used words like colored, and thought he was being progressive. Now she was about to make Harrison Whitmore III wish he had never learned her name. On Thursday morning, Victoria dressed in her most conservative business suit, navy blue with a white silk blouse and minimal jewelry, and drove to the offices of Hamilton, Brooks & Amp Associates, the white shoe law firm that had represented her family's business interests for 3 generations. She had an appointment with Richard Hamilton Jr., the senior partner who had handled her father's most sensitive transactions. Richard was waiting for her in his corner office, a room that screamed old money and older traditions. The walls were lined with law books bound in rich leather, and the furniture was the kind of heavy, masculine pieces that had probably been in the same spots since the Eisenhower administration. "Victoria," Richard said, standing to greet her with the kind of formal courtesy that men of his generation still practiced. "You look wonderful as always. How can I help you today?" "I want to buy a country club, Richard." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly, but to his credit, he didn't seem surprised. In his 40 years of legal practice, he had probably heard stranger requests from clients with serious money. "Any particular country club, or are you shopping around?" "Montclair Country Club in Buckhead. I want to purchase controlling interest in the holding company that owns it." "I see." Richard made a note on the legal pad in front of him. "And you want to do this because they rejected my membership application, and I think their decision-making process could benefit from new leadership." Richard's smile was thin but approving. "Ah, a business acquisition with personal satisfaction as a secondary benefit. Your father would be proud." "I hope so. What kind of timeline are we looking at?" "Fast. I want this completed within 30 days if possible." Richard nodded, already mentally calculating the steps required for such a complex transaction. "I'll need to research the ownership structure, identify the major shareholders, and determine what percentage of shares would constitute controlling interest. Then we'll need to approach each shareholder individually and negotiate purchase prices." "Money won't be an issue," Victoria said. "I'm prepared to pay premium prices for the shares, especially if it means faster completion." "How much of a premium?" Victoria had done her homework. Based on the club's current financial situation and the state of their facilities, the entire operation was probably worth around $12 million. In a normal sale, she could probably acquire controlling interest for $6 or $7 million. "I'm prepared to spend up to $20 million to acquire 51% of the holding company." Richard's pen stopped moving across his notepad. $20 million to buy a financially struggling country club was the kind of number that suggested this was about much more than business. "Victoria, that's considerably more than the property is worth." "The property isn't what I'm buying, Richard. I'm buying the right to make decisions about who gets to enjoy that property." "I understand." Richard made another note. "And once you have controlling interest, what are your plans for the club?" Victoria smiled, and Richard was reminded of why she had been so successful in the cutthroat world of venture capital. There was steel beneath her elegance, and anyone who underestimated her did so at their own peril. I plan to make some changes to their membership policies. The first share purchase was completed within a week. Eleanor Morrison, the widow of a former Atlanta mayor, owned 8% of Montclair Holdings. At 86 years old, she was more interested in liquidating her assets than maintaining country club traditions, especially when Victoria's lawyers offered her 3 times what her shares were worth on paper. The second purchase took a bit longer but was ultimately easier. The Randolph family had been members for 70 years, but their textile fortune had been declining for decades. When their patriarch died 6 months earlier, his children had inherited both his country club shares and his substantial debts. Victoria's offer to buy their 12% stake was large enough to pay off the estate's obligations and leave the heirs with a substantial windfall. By the end of the second week, Victoria had quietly acquired 23% of Montclair Holdings from 6 different families. None of the sellers seemed to understand that they were essentially handing control of their exclusive club to the woman who had been rejected for membership just 3 weeks earlier. The larger shareholders were more challenging. The Pemberton family owned 15% of the company, but they were still active members who used the club regularly for business entertaining and social events. The Ashford family controlled another 11% and had 3 generations of members who considered Montclair their second home. But Victoria had learned patience from her father, and she understood that every person had a price. It was just a matter of finding out what they valued most. Charles Pemberton was a real estate developer who specialized in luxury residential projects. Victoria's research revealed that his company was bidding on a massive mixed-use development in downtown Atlanta, a project that would require significant financing from exactly the kind of investors Victoria had relationships with. She arranged to run into Charles at a fundraising dinner for Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, approaching him during the cocktail hour with the casual confidence of someone making polite conversation. "Charles Pemberton," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "I don't think we've been formally introduced. Victoria Sterling." Charles was a handsome man in his early 50s, with a kind of silver fox appearance that played well in Atlanta's social circles. His handshake was firm, and his smile seemed genuine as he tried to place her name. "Sterling, of course. Sterling Enterprises. I've heard wonderful things about your work with emerging companies. Didn't you help finance the Beltline project?" "Among others," Victoria replied modestly. "I understand congratulations are in order. I heard through the grapevine that Pemberton Development is in the running for the Midtown Commons project." Charles's smile became more guarded. "Well, nothing's been announced officially, but yes, we're very excited about the possibilities. It's an impressive proposal. I had the opportunity to review the preliminary plans through some mutual contacts. Very ambitious scope. What is it, $800 million in total development costs? Something like that." Charles was clearly wondering how Victoria had gotten access to confidential project information, and whether her interest was professional or personal. "The financing structure must be complex for something that size. I imagine you're working with a consortium of investors." "We're still finalizing those arrangements." Victoria nodded understandingly. "Well, if you ever need additional capital partners, Sterling Enterprises has been very interested in large-scale mixed-use developments. We've had excellent returns on similar projects in Charlotte and Nashville." She handed him her business card with a casual gesture of someone planting seeds for future conversations. "I'd love to learn more about your vision for the project sometime." Charles studied the card, and Victoria could practically see him calculating the potential benefits of having her investment firm as a partner. "That would be very interesting to discuss." "Wonderful. Actually, I've been meaning to ask you about something completely different. I understand you're a member at Montclair Country Club. For about 15 years, yes. Beautiful facility." "I'm sure it is. I've heard they're going through some financial challenges lately. Nothing too serious, I hope." Charles's expression grew more cautious. "Where did you hear that?" "Oh, you know how these things go, rumors in the business community. Someone mentioned they might be looking for investors or considering some kind of restructuring. I hadn't heard anything like that, But I have to admit I don't pay much attention to the business side of the club. I just play golf and attend the occasional event. Victoria nodded sympathetically. Of course. I was asking because I've been considering applying for membership, but if they're having financial difficulties, it might not be the best time to get involved. You should definitely apply, Charles said with apparent sincerity. It's a wonderful community of people. Very welcoming, very family-oriented. That's good to hear. Although I have to admit, I've heard mixed things about their membership policies. Someone told me they can be quite selective. Charles looked uncomfortable, as if he suddenly remembered exactly who he was talking to and what selective might mean in this context. Well, I mean, it is a private club. They have standards, but they're reasonable standards. I'm sure someone with your background and accomplishments wouldn't have any problems. I hope you're right, Victoria said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Although I have to ask, would you put in a good word for me if I did apply? I understand recommendations from existing members carry a lot of weight. Of course, Charles replied immediately. I'd be happy to recommend you. Thank you so much. That means a great deal coming from someone I respect. Victoria glanced at her watch. I should let you get back to the party, but I'd love to continue our conversation about the Midtown project sometime soon. Absolutely. I'll have my assistant call your office to set something up. Victoria's smile was warm and grateful. Perfect. I look forward to it. 3 days later, Charles Pemberton received a call from Victoria's assistant requesting a meeting to discuss potential investment in the Midtown Commons project. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at Sterling Enterprises offices in Midtown Atlanta. Victoria's offices occupied the top 2 floors of a gleaming glass tower with panoramic views of the city skyline. The reception area was decorated in contemporary style with original artwork and expensive furniture that whispered of success without shouting about wealth. Charles arrived precisely on time, dressed in his best suit and carrying a leather portfolio filled with project details and financial projections. Victoria greeted him personally, leading him to a conference room where her senior partners were already assembled around a polished mahogany table. For the next 2 hours, Charles presented his vision for Midtown Commons while Victoria and her team asked probing questions about everything from construction timelines to revenue projections. The meeting was professional, thorough, and entirely focused on the business opportunity. It was only at the end of the presentation that Victoria introduced a personal element. This is exactly the kind of project Sterling Enterprises loves to support, she said, closing the folder of materials Charles had provided. Large-scale, long-term value creation, strong community impact. We'd be very interested in participating as a major investor. Charles's relief was visible. Securing Sterling Enterprises as a financial partner would virtually guarantee that his company would win the development bid. That's wonderful news, Victoria. What kind of investment level were you thinking about? We'd be prepared to commit up to $200 million in equity funding, plus we can arrange additional debt financing through our banking relationships. The number was larger than Charles had dared hope for. $200 million from Sterling Enterprises would not only cover their equity requirements but also give them significant leverage in negotiating with other investors and lenders. I don't know what to say, Charles admitted. This could be transformative for our company. I'm glad we can help. There is just one small matter we need to address first. Charles's expression grew more cautious. What kind of matter? Victoria opened a different folder and placed a document on the table in front of him. I understand you own 15% of Montclair Holdings, the company that operates Montclair Country Club. Charles stared at the document, a purchase agreement offering to buy his shares for 4 times their estimated market value. How did you? I mean, that's not public information. Charles, I'll be direct with you. I applied for membership at Montclair 3 weeks ago and was rejected. I have reason to believe that rejection was based on factors that had nothing to do with my qualifications or financial standing. Charles's face had gone pale as he began to understand the connection between Victoria's investment offer and the purchase agreement. Victoria, I want you to know that I personally had nothing to do with that decision. I wasn't even on the membership committee. I know that and I appreciate it. But I'm now in a position to acquire controlling interest in the club, and I'd prefer to do it through friendly negotiations rather than hostile takeover tactics. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to sell me your shares in Montclair Holdings. In exchange, Sterling Enterprises will proceed with our investment in the Midtown Commons project. Charles looked at the purchase agreement, then back at Victoria. And if I don't sell? Then Sterling Enterprises will unfortunately have to pass on the Midtown opportunity. We've learned to be very careful about partnering with individuals or companies that might have conflicting values. The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, but Charles understood it clearly. Victoria Sterling could make or break his company's most important project, and she was linking that decision to his cooperation in her acquisition of the country club. This feels like blackmail, he said quietly. This is business, Charles. You have something I want and I have something you need. The purchase price I'm offering for your club shares is extremely generous. You'll make more money from this transaction than your family paid for the shares originally. And your company will benefit from our partnership on Midtown Commons. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her expression remaining calm and professional. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't about revenge or spite. This is about ensuring that institutions like Montclair Country Club operate according to principles that reflect modern American values rather than outdated prejudices. What changes are you planning to make? Changes that will make the club stronger, more inclusive, and more financially stable. Changes that will benefit all members, not just the ones who look like the founding families. Charles studied the purchase agreement for several more minutes, weighing his options. Finally, he reached for the pen Victoria had placed beside the document. I hope you know what you're doing, he said, signing his name with quick, decisive strokes. I always know what I'm doing, Charles. That's why Sterling Enterprises has been so successful. The Ashford family proved to be more challenging. Unlike Charles Pemberton, they didn't need Victoria's money for any current business ventures. The Ashfords had been wealthy for generations, with diversified investments that made them essentially recession-proof. But they also had 3 college-age children whose futures depended on maintaining the family's social standing and business connections. Victoria spent 2 weeks researching the family's interests, charitable commitments, and social obligations before identifying their vulnerability. Margaret Ashford was a prominent patron of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra and served on the boards of several major cultural institutions. Her eldest daughter was currently applying to prestigious graduate programs in arts administration, while her son was hoping to establish himself in Atlanta's competitive architecture scene. Victoria arranged to attend the symphony's annual gala, where she made sure to introduce herself to Margaret during the cocktail reception. The conversation was pleasant and superficial, focusing on their shared appreciation for classical music and cultural philanthropy. It was only the following week that Victoria made her move, calling Margaret to discuss a business proposition that might interest the Ashford family. Margaret, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly, but I have an opportunity that I thought might appeal to your family's philanthropic interests. Of course, Victoria. What did you have in mind? I'm in the process of establishing a new foundation focused on arts education in underserved communities. The Sterling Foundation for Cultural Access will provide scholarships, internships, and mentorship programs for young people who want to pursue careers in the arts. Margaret's interest was immediately apparent. That sounds like exactly the kind of initiative we love to support. What would you need from us? Actually, I was hoping you might consider serving on our board of directors. Your experience with cultural institutions would be invaluable, and frankly, having the Ashford name associated with the foundation would give us tremendous credibility. I'd be honored to consider it. What kind of time commitment are we talking about? Very minimal. Quarterly board meetings, attendance at 1 or 2 fundraising events per year. But there would be one small matter I'd need to address first. What kind of matter? Well, the Foundation's charter requires that all board members be free of any investments or associations that might conflict with our commitment to diversity and inclusion. It's become a standard requirement for non-profit boards these days. Margaret was silent for a moment. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. I'm referring specifically to your family's ownership stake in Montclair Holdings. As I understand it, Montclair Country Club has some very exclusionary membership policies that would be inconsistent with our foundation's values. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Margaret spoke again. Victoria, are you asking us to sell our club shares in order to serve on your foundation board? I'm offering to purchase your shares at a very generous price, and separately inviting you to join our board. The foundation will be launching with an initial endowment of $50 million, and we expect to grow it to over $200 million within 5 years. Board service would provide excellent networking opportunities for your children as they establish their careers. Victoria paused to let the implications sink in. Of course, if you're not interested in the foundation opportunity, I completely understand. I know there are other families who would be eager to be associated with this level of cultural philanthropy. Margaret Ashford was too intelligent not to understand what Victoria was really offering. A choice between maintaining their country club shares and gaining access to one of the most well-funded cultural foundations in the Southeast. For a family whose social identity was built around arts patronage, it wasn't really a choice at all. I'd need to discuss this with my husband and children, Margaret said finally. Of course. Why don't you take a week to think it over? I'll have my attorneys prepare the share purchase agreement, and you can review the foundation materials at your convenience. By the end of her 4th week of acquisitions, Victoria owned 48% of Montclair Holdings. She was 3 percentage points away from controlling interest, but the remaining shareholders were proving to be more stubborn than she had anticipated. The final piece of the puzzle was Harrison Whitmore III himself, the man who had led the committee that rejected her membership application. Harrison owned 37% of the holding company, and his shares alone would give Victoria the control she needed. But Harrison Whitmore III was not motivated by money, business opportunities, or social advancement. He was motivated by pride, tradition, and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. Convincing him to sell would require a different approach entirely. Victoria had been researching the Whitmore family for weeks, looking for leverage that would force Harrison to negotiate. What she found was both surprising and useful. The Whitmore fortune was largely an illusion. Harrison's grandfather had indeed been wealthy, but 3 generations of poor investment decisions and expensive lifestyles had eroded the family assets to almost nothing. Harrison maintained the appearance of wealth through careful financial management and strategic use of credit, but the reality was that he was essentially living paycheck to paycheck on income from a modest trust fund. More importantly, Harrison was facing a personal financial crisis that he had managed to keep secret from Atlanta's social circles. His ex-wife's demands for increased alimony payments, combined with his current wife's expensive tastes and his own gambling debts, had pushed him to the brink of bankruptcy. The only significant asset Harrison still owned was his stake in Montclair Holdings, and he had been quietly exploring options for monetizing those shares without losing face in the community. Victoria decided to approach Harrison directly. She called him on a Wednesday morning, introducing herself politely and requesting a private meeting to discuss a business matter of mutual interest. Harrison agreed to meet her for lunch at the Capital City Club, another exclusive Atlanta establishment where he was confident he would be on familiar territory surrounded by people who shared his worldview. Victoria arrived at the club wearing a conservative gray suit and minimal jewelry, looking every inch the serious businesswoman. Harrison was already seated at a corner table, and he stood to greet her with the elaborate courtesy that Southern gentlemen of his generation still practiced. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, pulling out her chair with a flourish. "Thank you for joining me. I have to admit, I'm curious about this business matter you mentioned. Thank you for making the time, Mr. Whitmore. I know how busy you must be with your various commitments." They made polite conversation through the first course, discussing Atlanta's growth, the challenges facing traditional institutions, and the importance of preserving the city's unique character and heritage. Harrison clearly enjoyed playing the role of elder statesman, sharing his perspectives on everything from urban development to educational standards. It was only after their entrees arrived that Victoria introduced the real purpose of their meeting. "Mr. Whitmore, I'll be direct with you. I'm interested in acquiring a controlling stake in Montclair Holdings." Harrison's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "I beg your pardon. I've been purchasing shares from various families over the past month. I currently own 48% of the company, and I'd like to buy enough additional shares to reach 51%. Harrison set down his fork and stared at her with the expression of someone who had just been told that the laws of physics no longer applied. "You're talking about buying control of Montclair Country Club." "That's correct. But you're not even a member. Your application was." Harrison caught himself before finishing the sentence, apparently realizing how it would sound. "My application was rejected, yes. Which is why I've decided to purchase the club instead." Harrison's face had turned an alarming shade of red. This is outrageous. You can't just buy a private club because you didn't get accepted for membership." "Actually, I can. It's a straightforward business transaction between consenting adults. Those families had no right to sell their shares to someone outside the membership. There are traditions, protocols. There are no legal restrictions on share transfers in the corporate bylaws, Mr. Whitmore. I've had my attorneys review the documents very carefully." Harrison was sputtering now, his carefully maintained composure completely gone. What do you plan to do if you acquire control?" "I plan to modernize the club's membership policies, update the facilities, and put the organization on a sound financial footing for the next century." "Modernize the membership policies," Harrison repeated slowly. "You mean you want to change who can become a member?" "I want to ensure that membership decisions are based on qualifications and character, rather than on prejudices that have no place in modern society." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Victoria with the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly difficult puzzle. "This is all about revenge, isn't it? You were rejected for membership, so now you want to punish everyone who belongs to the club." Victoria's smile was patient but implacable. "Mr. Whitmore, this isn't about revenge. This is about justice. Montclair Country Club has operated as an exclusionary institution for 100 years, keeping out qualified people based on the color of their skin, their religion, or their family background. That era is ending, whether you participate in the transition or not. And if I refuse to sell my shares, then I'll continue acquiring shares from other families until I reach 51% ownership. It may take longer and cost more money, but the outcome will be the same." Victoria opened her briefcase and placed a purchase agreement on the table between them. "I'm prepared to offer you $12 million for your 37% stake in Montclair Holdings. That's considerably more than the shares are worth based on the club's current financial condition." Harrison stared at the document without touching it. $12 million would solve all of his financial problems and give him enough money to maintain his lifestyle for the rest of his life. But it would also mean surrendering control of the institution that represented everything he believed in about social hierarchy and traditional values. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "Of course. But I should mention that this offer expires in 72 hours. After that, I'll be pursuing other acquisition strategies that might not be as financially beneficial for the current shareholders." Victoria stood and extended her hand. "Thank you for lunch, Mr. Whitmore. I hope we can work together to ensure a smooth transition for everyone involved." Harrison Whitmore III spent the next 3 days in a state of emotional turmoil that his wife and friends couldn't help but notice. He consulted with lawyers, financial advisors, and other Montclair members, looking for a way to prevent Victoria Sterling from taking control of his beloved club. But the legal advice was unanimous. There was nothing he could do to stop her. Victoria had followed all applicable laws and regulations, and her purchase agreements with other shareholders were legally binding. If she wanted to spend $20 million to buy a financially troubled country club, That was her prerogative as an American citizen with more money than sense. The financial advice was equally clear. Harrison needed money, and Victoria's offer was far more generous than anything he was likely to receive from other potential buyers. His accountant pointed out that turning down $12 million out of pride would be the final act of financial self-destruction for the Whitmore family fortune. On Friday afternoon, Harrison called Victoria's office and requested another meeting. They met at Victoria's offices this time, in the same conference room where she had convinced Charles Pemberton to sell his shares. Harrison looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 3 days. His usually perfect grooming was slightly disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, settling heavily into the chair across from her, "I've given a great deal of thought to your proposal. I'm sure you have. It's not an easy decision." "No, it's not." Harrison was quiet for a moment, staring out the windows at the Atlanta skyline. "That club has been part of my family's life for 4 generations. My great-grandfather was one of the founding members. I understand how meaningful that history must be to you. Do you? Do you really understand what it means to watch everything your family has built be taken over by someone who doesn't share your values?" Victoria considered the question carefully. "Mr. Whitmore, my great-grandfather was a sharecropper in rural Georgia. My grandfather worked in a textile mill for 40 years and never earned enough money to buy his own home. My father built a construction company from nothing, facing discrimination and obstacles that would have broken lesser men." She leaned forward slightly, her voice growing stronger. "I understand exactly what it means to watch institutions and systems work against your family for generations. The difference is that my family responded by building something new rather than by trying to preserve something that was never rightfully ours in the first place." Harrison flinched as if she had slapped him. "That club was built by my ancestors. That club was built by men who excluded people like me and my family from participating in the economic and social opportunities they reserved for themselves. Your ancestors didn't create their wealth in isolation. They created it by limiting competition and maintaining artificial barriers to entry." Victoria's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath her words. "I'm not trying to destroy what your family built, Mr. Whitmore. I'm trying to fulfill its potential by making it accessible to everyone who deserves to be there." Harrison was silent for a long moment. Finally, he reached for the purchase agreement that lay between them on the polished conference table. "If I sign this," he said slowly, "what guarantees do I have that you'll treat existing members fairly? You have my word that current members in good standing will be welcome to remain at the club as long as they treat all other members with respect and courtesy. The only thing that will change is that future membership decisions will be based on merit rather than prejudice. And you'll maintain the club's traditions. The golf tournaments, the social events, the holiday celebrations. I'll maintain the traditions that bring people together and enhance the club's sense of community. I'll eliminate the traditions that exclude or diminish anyone based on characteristics they can't control." Harrison signed the document with a shaking hand, then pushed it back across the table to Victoria. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do, Mr. Whitmore. And I think you'll find that the changes I make will benefit everyone, including members who are initially resistant to them." The news of Victoria Sterling's acquisition of Montclair Country Club spread through Atlanta's social circles like wildfire. Within hours of the purchase agreement being filed with the state, local news outlets were reporting the story as a major business transaction with significant social implications. The reactions were as divided as Victoria had expected. Younger, more progressive members of Atlanta's elite praised the acquisition as long overdue progress toward making the city's institutions more inclusive. Older, more traditional voices condemned it as an attack on Atlanta's heritage and a dangerous precedent for other private organizations. But Victoria was too busy planning the club's transformation to pay much attention to the commentary. She had work to do. Her first act as majority owner was to call a meeting of the club's board of directors, where she introduced herself formally and outlined her vision for Montclair's future. The presentation was professional, comprehensive, and left no doubt about who was now in charge. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, standing at the head of the polished mahogany table in the club's boardroom, "I want to begin by acknowledging the significance of this transition for everyone involved. Montclair Country Club has been an important institution in Atlanta for 100 years, and I have no intention of diminishing its status or destroying its character." The board members, 6 men and 2 women ranging in age from their 40s to their 70s, listened in tense silence. Most of them had been personally involved in rejecting Victoria's membership application just 5 weeks earlier. "However," Victoria continued, "it's clear that the club needs to evolve in order to remain relevant and financially viable for the next century. That evolution will require changes to our membership policies, our facilities, and our approach to community engagement." She turned to a large projection screen and began outlining her plans. "First, we will immediately revise our membership criteria to focus exclusively on character, financial stability, and commitment to the club's values of excellence and community service. Race, religion, ethnic background, and family pedigree will no longer be factors in membership decisions." Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. "Second, we will invest $15 million in facility improvements over the next 18 months. This will include complete renovation of the golf course, modernization of the clubhouse, and addition of new amenities that will attract younger members and families." Victoria clicked to the next slide, which showed architectural renderings of proposed improvements. "Third, we will establish the Montclair Community Outreach Program, which will provide scholarships and mentorship opportunities for young people from underserved communities who are interested in golf, tennis, and other club activities." The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from staff training programs to marketing strategies designed to attract a more diverse membership base. When Victoria finished, the boardroom was completely silent. Finally, Margaret Ashford, who had sold her shares but retained her board position, raised her hand tentatively. "Victoria, these plans are very ambitious. How do you plan to fund all of these improvements?" "The facility renovations will be funded through a combination of cash reserves and a special assessment on current members. The community outreach program will be supported by the Sterling Foundation and other charitable partners." Another board member, a banking executive named Robert Crawford, cleared his throat. "What about members who are uncomfortable with these changes? Will there be any accommodation for those who prefer the club's traditional atmosphere?" Victoria's smile was pleasant but implacable. "Robert, I want to be very clear about something. This club will welcome all members who are committed to treating their fellow members with respect and courtesy, regardless of background. Members who are unable or unwilling to embrace that standard of behavior will be encouraged to seek other accommodations." The message was unmistakable. Adapt to the new reality or leave. Over the next 6 months, Victoria's transformation of Montclair Country Club proceeded with the efficiency of a well-planned military campaign. The facility improvements were completed on schedule and within budget, creating a stunning showcase that attracted attention from architectural magazines and hospitality industry publications. The membership changes were more dramatic. Within the first month, 37 families resigned their memberships rather than accept the new policies. But they were quickly replaced by new members who brought fresh energy and perspectives to the club. Dr. Jennifer Washington, a prominent cardiothoracic surgeon, became the first Black member in the club's history when she was unanimously approved by the revised membership committee. She was followed by David Kim, a tech entrepreneur whose family had been turned down 3 times during the previous decade, and Maria Santos, a federal judge whose application had been rejected because her husband was a first-generation immigrant from El Salvador. The changes weren't just symbolic. The new members brought business connections, charitable relationships, and social networks that expanded the club's influence throughout Atlanta's diverse professional community. Membership applications, which had been declining for years, suddenly surged as the city's emerging leaders sought access to the revitalized club. But Victoria's most satisfying moment came 6 months after the acquisition, during the club's annual Christmas gala. The event had traditionally been the most exclusive social gathering in Atlanta's calendar, attended only by the oldest and most prominent families. This year's gala was different. The ballroom was filled with a cross-section of Atlanta's leadership, black and white, young and old, entrepreneurs and artists, long-time Atlantans and recent transplants who had contributed to the city's growth and vitality. Victoria stood near the entrance, greeting guests with the gracious warmth that had made her such an effective business leader. She wore an elegant emerald green gown that complemented her skin tone perfectly, and her natural hair was styled in an upswept design that showcased diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. Halfway through the evening, she noticed Harrison Whitmore III standing alone near the bar, looking uncomfortable and out of place among the diverse crowd of new members. Victoria approached him with a champagne flute in her hand and the kind of smile that had once convinced him to sell her his shares. "Mr. Whitmore," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you decided to stay for the gala. Are you enjoying yourself?" Harrison looked around the ballroom with the expression of someone who had awakened in an unfamiliar place. "It's different from previous years." "Different how?" "More diverse," he said carefully. "More people I don't recognize." Victoria followed his gaze, taking in the scene of Atlanta's new elite mingling with representatives of the old guard. "I think that's a good thing, don't you? The city has grown and changed so much over the past few decades. It makes sense that the club should reflect that evolution." Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "That woman over there, Dr. Washington, I think her name is? She performed surgery on my neighbor's father last month. Saved his life, apparently." "Yes, Jennifer is extraordinary. One of the best cardiac surgeons in the Southeast. And that young man by the fireplace. He's the one who started that computer company, isn't he?" "David Kim, yes. His company has created over 3,000 jobs in Atlanta in the past 5 years." Harrison nodded slowly. I suppose these are the kind of people who would strengthen the club's reputation." Victoria's smile was genuinely warm. "I think your grandfather would have approved, Mr. Whitmore. He was a businessman first, wasn't he? He understood that success comes from recognizing talent and potential, regardless of where you find it." Harrison considered this, then raised his champagne glass in a small gesture of acknowledgement. "To new traditions," he said quietly. "To better traditions," Victoria replied, touching her glass to his. As the evening wound down, Victoria stood on the club's terrace overlooking the golf course she had helped redesign. The December air was crisp but not cold, and the lights of Atlanta twinkled in the distance like stars. Behind her, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from the ballroom where Atlanta's most influential leaders were building relationships that would shape the city for decades to come. These were the connections she had been denied access to 5 months earlier, the networks of power and influence that had been reserved for people who looked different from her. Now she controlled those networks. More importantly, she had opened them to everyone who deserved to be part of them. Victoria thought about her father, about the lessons he had taught her about patience, strategy, and the importance of turning other people's mistakes into opportunities. Jonathan Sterling hadn't lived to see his daughter transform one of Atlanta's most exclusive institutions, but she knew he would have been proud of the way she had handled the challenge. The rejection letter from Montclair Country Club was framed in her home office now, displayed not as a reminder of past hurts but as a testament to the power of persistence and strategic thinking. Every time she looked at it, Victoria was reminded that the best revenge wasn't getting even, it was getting everything. And she had gotten everything. Control of the club that had rejected her, the satisfaction of forcing change on an institution that had resisted progress for a century, and the opportunity to create something better from the ashes of something that had outlived its usefulness. But most importantly, Victoria Sterling had gotten justice. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had been excluded from opportunities they deserved, everyone who had been judged by their appearance rather than their achievements, everyone who had been told they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. The country club that had rejected her membership application no longer existed. In its place was something new, something better, something that reflected the values of excellence and inclusion that Victoria had learned from her father. And she was just getting started.